Welcome back to chapter 6, where we are delving into the integumentary system. This is video 2. Last lecture, we ended talking about the specialized cells of the integumentary system. And so some of these integumentary system specialized cells, as a recap, you have your dendritic cells, which are Langerhans cells, also called Langerhans cells, excuse me. You have tactile cells, also called Merkel cells, and then you have melanocytes. Dendritic or Langerhans cells are part of the immune protection of the cell. These are found in the stratum spinosum, so they're not in that base layer or the deepest layer of the epidermis. They're located just one layer up in the stratum spinosum. They are phagocytes. Remember, phago means to eat, cyto means cell. So these are cells that go around looking for infection, looking for debris, things like that, and it eats it up to clear up and clean up the area. You have tactile cells, or also called Merkel cells. Remember, tactile means to touch. So, um, so these are going to be your sensory receptor cells for light touch, meaning if someone brushes against your skin, when you put your shirt on, if you had a feather or something soft rub against your skin, you feel it because of these tactile or Merkel cells located in the stratum basale. Now, these Merkel cells, you'll find the nerve ending or the end of that sensory nerve in the stratum basale, but the rest of it, the tactile disc, is actually deeper in the dermis. All right, so they're located more superficially because of the light touch. Then you have melanocytes. These are the cells that produce melanin. Melanocytes are going to be located in the stratum basale, the base layer or the deepest layer of the epidermis. Melanocytes produce melanin, which is a pigment. This is what gives our skin its color, what gives our hair its color. And note that everyone has melanin. Every single person, from the fairest person to the darkest person, from the darkest person to the fairest person, we all have melanin. There are different types of melanin, and we all have different amounts of melanin, but everyone has it. What melanin does is it absorbs UV light from the sun. So when the sun shines, one of the things that it does is it sends out these ultraviolet rays onto all the surfaces that it's sending light. When those ultraviolet rays hit our skin, then it potentially can damage those skin cells by damaging the DNA, by damaging other structures in those cells that are close to the surface. And by damaging DNA, for example, you can potentially cause skin cancer. So when you have skin cancer, or when you have any cancer, basically these are cells that no longer follow the rules because their blueprint, the information, the genetic coding for that particular cell has been damaged. So by having melanin in the skin, you are more protected from that UV damage, and you're less likely to get skin cancers because of that UV damage. So that is part of what melanin does. Melanin is distributed in those keratinocytes. Remember, once the cell gets pushed from the stratum basale closer to the surface, they start to produce and hold on to keratin. They become keratinocytes. Um, and so melanin is then distributed to those cells. So to look at the skin again, image of the skin, you have your stratum basale, which is going to be this layer here. Remember, the stratum basale is a single layer of cells. It's a single layer of cells. So it's going to be those cells here. They're a little deeper purple with the blue nucleus. And these cells are going to sit on the basement membrane, and that is going to be what delineates the epidermis from the dermis. You have your tactile cells where the end of it is going to be located in the epidermis. The rest of that neuron is going to be in the dermis. Your melanocytes are going to be in the stratum basale, and you'll see how it has these branches or tentacles coming out. We'll talk about that shortly. You have your dendritic cells here. Remember, these cells, after they come from the stratum basale, they get pushed toward the surface and they start to produce keratin. And so they become then keratinocytes. Here you have your stratum granulosum. So now more of the cells, as it gets closer to the surface, have more keratin in it, and they start under a microscope, they'll look like little keratin granules. This must be a picture of thick skin, because then you have your clear cells. These are the stratum lucidum, but remember that's only found in thick skin, on the palms and soles. Then you have your stratum corneum, that is the dead, flattened cells that are full of keratin. They have no organelles, and that is what protects us from losing water, from getting, bacteria and things in our bodies as easily, and other problems that could arise. So let's talk about skin color. So skin color mainly comes from the melanin pigment that is produced by melanocytes that are located in the stratum basale. We have two different types of melanin. There's eumelanin and then pheomelanin. When you look up EU, the prefix U, usually it means like good. If I remember correctly, I think pheo means color. So make sure that you look that up just to check. So eumelanin is going to be that darker melanin. That's going to be the brownish black pigment. And then pheomelanin is not going to be quite as dark. It's going to be your reddish yellow pigment. Pheomelanin is found in every body, and it's in different locations. For example, the lips are usually a lighter color than the skin, and the lips will contain pheomelanin. All right. Other factors that affect skin color, you have, well, first bullet point says all people have the same number of melanocytes. So again, from the very darkest person to the very lightest person, we all have the same amount of melanocytes. It really depends on the type of melanin that cell produces and the amount of melanin granules that cell produces. And the size of the melanin granules. So there are different sizes of melanin granules. If a person actually does lack melanin, I know I said that everyone has melanin, but of course, nothing is finite in science and in medicine. So if a person actually lacks melanin, then they are called albinos. That is a condition of albinism. Let me rephrase that. The condition is called albinism. They're not called albinos. The condition is called albinism. But that is a genetic mutation of the genes. Unless you have albinism, then everyone has melanin being produced by their melanocytes. Other factors that affect skin color, you have environmental factors. So sunlight, UV light from sun lamps, X-rays, all of those, when it hits the skin, it will cause a reaction by the melanocytes. So basically what's happening is your melanocytes, because they are protecting your skin from that UV damage, once you have more and more sun exposure, once you have more and more light exposure, UV light exposure, those melanocytes get activated and they start to produce more melanin. They start to produce more melanin. This is why, for those of you who wear makeup, it's likely that you need to wear or you need to purchase like a summer foundation and a winter foundation because your skin tone is different in both seasons. When the sun is brighter, shines more, we all tend to be a little bit darker. Again, it doesn't matter if you are a very dark skinned person or a very light skinned person. In the summer, we all are darker than we are in the winter because we have more sun exposure. And those melanocytes start to produce more melanin to help protect you from sun damage and potentially DNA damage, causing things like skin cancers. Other factors, physiological factors that can affect skin color. You have oxygenation in the blood of the dermal blood vessels. So whether or not you have high oxygen in your bloodstream or low oxygen in your bloodstream, that's going to affect the color of your skin. Think about if you get hot. When you get hot, part of what's happening in the body is the blood starts to come closer to the surface so that it can release the heat into the environment. And because more of your blood is coming to the surface, your skin gets more red. Just like if you were to brush your skin like vigorously to heat up your skin will become red. That redness, or more, pinkish, as the PowerPoint says, is because now you have more blood to the surface. The opposite of that is for someone who lacks oxygen. So we've all seen in the movies where someone has stopped breathing, whether it's because of a medical condition or because someone has forced them to stop breathing, or someone gets really, really cold and their lips, their fingertips, their toes may start to turn blue. That condition is called cyanosis. Cyan is a name of a blue color. So someone who has high levels of oxygenation in the blood, their blood will tend to be a deeper red. Um, and you can see that like as the blood, yeah, you can see that. As the blood has less and less oxygen, the skin tends to turn blue because of the lack of oxygen. And in the second one, I actually started mentioning that in the first bullet point, but vasodilation and vasoconstriction can also change the color of skin. Dilation means to get bigger. So vasodilation, vaso means vessel. When the vessels get bigger, when the vessels open up, then more blood can flow through that vessel. Constriction means to tighten. So with vasoconstriction, the blood vessels get smaller, so less blood can flow through. So vasodilation is actually what occurs when your skin gets hot, heated, or when you start to brush the skin vigorously. That is when you get an opening of the blood vessels closer to the skin surface and you start to see more red. I misspoke when I talked about it earlier, but that's basically when that happens. Vasoconstriction, you have less blood vessels going to, or less blood going through blood vessels in that area, and that can cause the skin to be less red. Skin color can change from an accumulation of keratin pigment from the diet. So if a person eats lots and lots of carrots and other fruit or vegetables with keratin in it, like those red or red, orange, or yellow color vegetables. If you tend to eat a lot of it in short periods of time, your body may not be able to keep up with the processing of that pigment. And because of that, your body can take that orange pigment and start storing it in the skin until it's able to come back later and process it. Um, the next one talks about jaundice. Jaundice is also a yellowing of the skin, like the accumulation of keratin, but it's caused because of liver damage. So with jaundice, the liver cannot process old, dead um, red blood cells. So when red blood cells get old, the body, they go through the spleen. The spleen basically checks all the red blood cells. When they get old, when they get damaged, the spleen takes it out of circulation, and the liver starts to process all of that, the material from those red blood cells, especially the hemoglobin. If that hemoglobin is not able to be processed well, then it starts to accumulate in the skin. So both jaundice and accumulation of keratin can cause a yellowing of the skin. We'll talk about in a few slides how we can determine the difference between the two. But those are some of the environmental and physiological factors that can affect the color of your skin. So this case, you do want to pay attention to this clinical application to understand how UV rays can negatively affect um, skin color and cause potential skin cancer. All right, so epidermis. Epidermis is the name of the most superficial layer of skin. Deep to that is the dermis. Remember that, well, don't remember because I haven't said it yet. All right, so dermis is going to be that deeper layer of the skin, the second layer of the integumentary system. It is going to be about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. When we looked at the pictures, the images and the pictures of the microscope slides of the epidermis, you noticed how there were like these hills and valleys that went along the base of the epidermis and the superficial end of the dermis. Those projections are called dermal papillae. Dermal papillae. All right. Yeah, dermal papillae between the epidermal ridges. We'll talk about that. The dermis binds the epidermis to underlying tissue. So remember, the dermis is connective tissue, whereas the epidermis is epithelial tissue. One of the jobs of connective tissue is to bind structures, and this is an example of how those tissues bind structures. So these connective tissues in the dermis are binding the epidermis to the subcutaneous layer, the muscle, the subcutaneous layer and deeper tissues. The dermis will contain connective tissue, of course, because it's predominantly connective tissue, but you also have things like muscle fibers and nerve cell processes. So there's movement in your dermis and there is nerve stimulation in the dermis. Dermal blood vessels there are blood vessels associated with the dermis, of course, because it's predominantly connective tissue. And that is what's going to supply nutrients to the epidermal layer. In the dermis, you also have your hair follicles. So the follicles that produce hair, and you have sweat glands as well as sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce sebum. Sebum is the medical term for oil. So you have hair follicles that produces hair. You also have glands that produce sweat and oil. You also have sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are going to be the part of nerves or part of the nervous system that information about um, receive information about the senses. So touch, taste, pressure, all of those are parts of what sensory receptors, information that sensory receptors receive. The sensory receptors that are located in the dermis are your Pacinian corpuscles, also called lamellated corpuscles, tactile corpuscles, or Meissner's corpuscles. So the lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles are for pressure, so deeper touch. And your tactile or Meissner's corpuscles are for light touch. So deep touch meaning when you sit on a chair, your body weight is on your bottom. That is a deeper pressure than if somebody lightly brushed against your skin. And those are two different types of sensory receptors to receive two different types of information. In your dermis, you have two different layers. There's the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is going to be the most superficial layer. It will be the layer that is closest to the epidermis. The reticular layer is deep to that. So it's going to be of the two layers, it's going to be the furthest away from the epidermis. Papillary layer contains areolar connective tissue. I told you it's coming back. So make sure that you go back to chapter 5 to look at the images and understand what areolar connective tissue is. Of the two layers, your papillary layer is going to be the thinner one. But this is also where your dermal papillae is located. Dermal papillae is what forms your fingerprints. So on the thick skin of the palms of your hands, you have prints. On the fingertips, you have fingerprints. On your palms, you have palm prints. All of those prints come from the dermal papillae. So when we go back to the image and we see those projections and depressions that are located in those spaces between the epidermis and the dermis, know that those projections are what creates our fingerprints, along with, of course, extra stratum corneum that is located on the palms and soles because it's thick skin. So dermal papillae forms fingerprints, and those are located in the papillary layer. So papillary layer has papillae, which forms fingerprints. The deeper layer is the reticular layer. It has dense, irregular connective tissue. So papillary layer has areolar connective tissue. Reticular layer has dense, irregular connective tissue. It's going to be the thicker of the two layers. So in this image, we see, starting from most superficial to deepest, we have the epidermis, that is this deeper layer with the projections and the dips. Remember that this epidermis is following the hair shaft, the hair follicle. It's dipped into where the hair follicle is. But these ridges are what's going to create your fingerprints and palm prints in that thick skin that we have. So the more of the stratum corneum, the more it's going to pick up the ridges from the dermal papillae. Deep to that is your dermis. And remember, your dermis has two layers. You have the areolar connective tissue in the more superficial layer. You have your dense, irregular connective tissue in that deeper layer of the dermis. And then deep to all of that, you have your subcutaneous layer. Inside of the dermis, you have your blood vessels, you have your nerve cells, you have your your Pacinian corpuscles, which are for deeper touch. All of these structures, the sweat glands, the oil producing glands, all of that is going to be located in your dermis. Also, there is muscle. So here is uh, a muscle that is associated with the dermis. Some other structures associated with skin, we call these accessory structures. Accessory structures are going to originate from the epidermis and then extend into the dermis or even the hypodermis subcutaneous layer. The accessory structures are your hair follicles, your nails, and your glands, so the sweat and sebaceous glands. If there is injury, if there is burn to the structures, to the skin, if the accessory structures are not burned or destroyed in that damage, then the structures can regenerate. If they happen to be destroyed, then they cannot regenerate. So to go back to this, it says that the accessory structures originate in the epidermis and extend into the dermis or hypodermis. Let's go back to the previous image. Remember I said that this is your epidermis. All of this is epidermis, and you could tell the difference because it's generally a different color. It also has a different look, right? Because the cells are oriented differently than the cells in the dermis. So when you see this hair follicle, you see it also has this epidermal tissue associated with it or surrounding it. And that's because, as the previous slide said, this follicle started in the epidermis and then sort of dipped into the dermis. And some of these structures will start in the dermis and dip into the subcutaneous or hypodermic layer. But that is why you'll see this epidermal tissue deep in the dermis, because this structure started here and dipped down. Nails. Nails are the protective coverings on the ends of the fingers and toes. Nails have three parts to them. You have the nail body, also called the nail plate. You have the nail bed, and then there's the nail matrix. Then you also have associated with the nails, the lunula and the cuticle. The nail plate or the nail body is the visible part, the visible part. So when we look at our nails, when we paint our nails, the nail, when we scratch somebody, we're scratching, we're doing all of that with the nail plate or the nail body. The nail is made up of keratinized cells. So same type of thing that's happening on the epidermis, the surface of your skin. Those are also filled with keratin. And that's going to overlie or lay over the nail bed. The nail bed is the surface of the skin right under the nail plate. So if your nail was removed, what you would be able to see is the nail bed. Then you have the nail matrix. The nail matrix is going to be that active growing region of the nail. You cannot really see that because it's at that proximal end of the nail bed. All right, so proximal end, remember proximal and distal. When we talk about proximal and distal, we're using those terms in reference to structures associated with the arms and legs. And proximal means that it's closer to the point of attachment of the arm and leg. So the nail matrix is the more proximal end of the nail itself. So keep that in mind. The lunula is that half moon shaped area that sits over the nail matrix. The lunula, some people see it on more of their nails, some people see it on very few, but if you look at your nail and you have that clear, almost whitish portion of it close to the nail bed, I'm sorry, close to the nail matrix, that is the lunula. Lun means moon, right? So that's why it's called like a half moon shaped. So lunula is going to be a moon shaped something, and that's what we're looking at. So the pale half moon shaped region that lies over the nail matrix, the nail matrix conceals the deeper blood vessels. Then you have the cuticle. The cuticle is the fold that's at that proximal end of the nail. All right, so when we go and get our nails done, they clean out the cuticle. They remove some of that skin associated with the cuticle so that it's not as thick. But that's the cuticle. The cuticle is part of the stratum corneum that extends slightly over the nail. Remember, the stratum corneum is the superficial most layer of the epidermis. It is dead keratinized cells. So that stratum corneum basically creates more of a flap that covers over the proximal end of that nail. So you have the nail plate, that again, the nail plate or the body of the nail is the portion of the nail that we're able to see, that we're able to paint, that we're able to use to scratch, etc. This is considered the free edge. So the edge, the part where we say, oh, our nails are getting long, that's the free edge of the nail. You have the lunula. Again, some people will have a lunula visible, some people won't. Some people have them on just a few of their nails. That is the half moon looking area at the proximal end of the nail. Then you have the cuticle. The cuticle, remember, is the stratum corneum that has created a cover or a flap for the proximal end of the nail. Then you have the nail matrix. So the nail matrix is where the nail actually is growing. So the nail matrix is going to produce the keratin that lays down the nail, the part of the nail, right? The part of the nail that we see. So this is going to produce more of this, and then that's going to be pushed outward so that now you see nail growth outside, longer and longer nail growth outside of that nail matrix. Let's talk hair. So hair follicles. Hair is present on all surfaces of the skin except the palms of the hand, soles of the feet, the lips, the nipples, and parts of some of the external reproductive organs. So you will not see hair, whether it is thick hair or that very, very fine hair, on any of those parts. Now we say on the nipples, but remember, because some people do have hair associated with their breasts, but it's not on the actual nipple part itself. The nipple part itself is hairless. The skin around the nipples, the areolar tissue around the nipples might have hair on it, but the nipples themselves do not. Just like the lips, some people have mustaches. Mustaches are not actually on the lips, even though they can extend over the lips. It's that skin above or superior to the lips that have hair and hair follicles. So a hair follicle is a tube-like depression of epidermal cells, which is what we saw in the images, from which hair develops. It extends into the dermis or the subcutaneous layer. All right. And we looked at that in the previous image, how it dips into that dermis, or it can also dip deeper into the subcutaneous layer. Hair has three parts. Excuse me. Hair has three parts. You have the hair root, the hair bulb, and the hair shaft. The hair root extends from the skin surface to the dermis or hypodermis. So the hair root is that part underneath the surface that you don't see. The hair bulb is the deepest part of the hair root, and that's where you have the dividing cells of the hair matrix. So that's where all the growth is happening. And then the hair shaft is the portion of the hair that we see, the portion of the hair that we comb and braid, etc. That is going to be what extends beyond the surface of the skin, and it is composed of dead epidermal cells. So your hair is basically made up of the same thing as your skin. It's just packaged differently, but hair is made up of the same things as your skin, those dead keratinized epidermal cells, right? So hair root, hair bulb, hair shaft. The hair root is the part that's deep in the skin, in the dermis or the hypodermis. The bulb is the deepest part of the root where you have all the dividing cells, and then you have the hair shaft, what you see. So it is the hair root and bulb that in the detective shows and the police shows where someone is looking for the person of interest and they find a hair. If the hair has a root and a bulb on it, they can take that and then look at the DNA that is present in this hair bulb. All right. Hair papilla. Hair papilla contains the blood vessels to nourish the hair. So this is a structure that is associated with this hair follicle. Hair color is due to the type and amount of melanin. So if your hair is darker, just like if your skin is darker, you have more melanin and you have the darker melanin. So you have more of the eumelanin associated with darker hair and skin. Lighter hair and skin have less melanin and less eumelanin, and they may have more of the pheomelanin associated with their hair and or skin. Erector pili. Erector pili is the name of the muscle associated with the hair follicles. So think for a minute. You sometimes have your hair follicles or your hair shaft stand on edge, right? So if you are cold, if you are shocked or afraid, your hair will stand up. The reason it's able to do that is because of the erector pili muscle. This is a muscle that contracts in response to either cold or fear. So when you have goosebumps, it's these erector pili muscles that are contracted. When you're cold, when you're afraid, and the erector pili muscle contracts, because these erector pili muscles are associated with the hair follicle, then it's going to pull that hair follicle out of its original location and have it have it stand more vertically. And so that's how you get your hairs to stand up because that muscle is pulling on the hair follicle. So again, you have your epidermis, you have your dermis, and you have your subcutaneous or hypodermic area. You have epidermal tissue associated with and surrounding the hair follicle because this originates in the epidermis and kind of dips down into the dermis and subcutaneous layer. You have the erector pili muscle that is associated, is attached to your hair follicle. And when this contracts, that's going to pull the hair follicle that way. And because it pulls the hair follicle that way, that hair is then going to stand up on edge. And then it's not until you warm up or you're no longer afraid that that erector pili muscle can relax and allow that hair follicle to go back to the position that it was. So fear or cold, that muscle contracts and pulls the hair follicle so that then the hair shaft stands up on edge. This is a image of a microscope slide. You can see how this particular hair shaft is actually dipping into the subcutaneous layer. And you know that it's subcutaneous layer because you have more and more adipose tissue associated with it. But you also have your epidermal cells surrounding that hair follicle. You have your hair root and bulb here. I'm sorry, hair root here. The hair bulb is going to be the end of the hair where everything is growing. So hair bulb, hair root, and then once it extends past the skin, that'll be the hair shaft. There, I don't see any adipose tissue. I'm sorry, not adipose tissue. I don't see any muscles up here that might be a muscle that might be one of the erector pili muscles. I'm not sure, but if this were, it would be attached, somewhere here, so that when it contracts, it pulls the shaft that way. I'm sorry, pulls the hair root that way, so that then that shaft will move that way and stand up on edge. Let's stop here for now, and we will finish or continue uh, with the next video.